Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for being here today. I hope you're having a great time at the conference. I wish I could be there with you in person, but unfortunately, this pandemic does not seem willing to let go of us just yet. So I'm just going to get right to my talk. My name is Alex Khasnabish. I'm a professor at Mount Saint Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And, I do my work on social movements, social change, and radical politics. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. My talk is entitled Black Pills in Clown World, Public Anthropology and the New Fascism. My talk today is about social movements, radical politics, and the practice of publicly engaged social research in challenging times. I've entitled it Black Pills in Clown World as a reference to two of the most popular tropes amongst fascists and far-right organizers and activists today. In the discourse of the far right, particularly its online varieties, black pilling is a riff off of the concept of red pilling. Red pilling is a reference to the scene in the sci-fi movie The Matrix, in which Neo, the protagonist, is given the choice by the enigmatic revolutionary Morpheus to see the world for what it really is, or to turn away from struggle and return to a state of blissful ignorance. The choice to wake up is presented to Neo by Morpheus in the form of a red pill, while reconciliation with the status quo is signified by a blue pill. The red pill represents radical consciousness, while the blue pill represents acceptance of ruling class hegemony. Far-right and fascist activists and organizers have since taken this a step further. While a person's awakening is red pilling, the recognition that the world as it is lies beyond a political solution and must be allowed to die is black pilling. While this may sound nihilistic, it's a mistake to reduce it to that alone. In terms that would be familiar to radicals and revolutionaries of the left, black pilling is the recognition that dominant institutions and their associated social relations cannot be reformed and must be destroyed before they can be replaced. More than this, taking the black pill means recognizing one's role in the critical work of bringing about the collapse of the status quo by accelerating the crises that plague it. As for clown world, that phrase is a reference to what fascists and other far-right actors view as the current, ridiculous, broken, and upside-down state of the world. The liberal capitalist world order is the clown world, and those who recognize its unredeemable brokenness are black-pilled. More than this, clown world is a specific denunciation of what gets grouped under the label of social justice warriorism, including everything from trigger warnings and gender-neutral bathrooms to decolonization and racial justice initiatives. Online, black pilling in clown world looks a lot like nihilistic, ironic shitposting, with users circulating memes that revel in the degraded, absurd nature of the world as it is. But this is not all that black pilling is. Indeed, as a practice, it plays a critical role not only in circulating fascist and far-right ideas and imagery, but in moving people toward taking action in the real world necessary to accelerate the crises of our times. For committed fascist and far-right activists and organizers, the question is not only how to radicalize normies into seeing the world the way they do, but how to move people to take decisive action. While this has always been the challenge for radicals and revolutionaries of all stripes, the digital infrastructure that drives so much of our communication today has added new layers and capacities to this very old dynamic. For mainstreamers, the issue is how to inject far-right and fascist ideas into conventional discourse and popularize them. This is in large part what the alt-right has attempted to do through a focus on culture wars and metapolitics. For vanguardists, the issue is how to radicalize enough committed cadres that they will do what is necessary to enact forms of militant, leaderless resistance that will accelerate the collapse of the status quo and bring on the race war they long for. Many acts of alleged lone wolf terrorism today fall into this camp, as does the activity of groups looking to build white ethnostates. In this talk, I explore what a publicly and politically engaged anthropology can offer in an age of black pills and clown world, a time of far-right and fascist resurgence amidst the mounting crises of the status quo. As someone who identifies, no matter how ambivalently, with the label of scholar activist, I think it's important to think about the relationship between what and how we study and why. As a student of social movements, I think it's vital to critically examine the mandate and utility of our scholarly work, to explore what it's good for and whose interests it serves. I want to consider these issues in light of my current research that explores the resurgence of fascism and the rise of a new formation of radical right-wing politics that has become transnational in nature and poses a direct and existential threat to the liberal order that has been dominant on a global scale since the end of World War II, when fascism was allegedly defeated. In pulling on the threads that bind these disparate areas of inquiry together, I aim to chart what one kind of publicly engaged anthropological practice looks like and what it offers beyond the well-worn tropes of social uplift and informed citizenship. I doubt anyone needs to be convinced that we are living through a time of disruption where the institutions and relations, rhythms and routines of the liberal capitalist world order and the ontological and epistemological assumptions upon which it rests appear increasingly threadbare and insufficient to addressing the crises that confront us. Indeed, as radicals of many stripes exhort us to understand, the status quo is incapable of mounting effective responses to this crisis complex because it is its source. As the COVID-19 pandemic has so starkly illustrated, the parameters of the politically possible are etched by the interests of the ruling class. Vaccines can be designed and produced in record time, but paid sick days are a bridge too far. Dramatically restricting the movement and activity of people has become ritualized over the last year for huge swaths of humanity, but rebuilding public health and civic infrastructure in ruins is not on the agenda. As health, ecological, economic, social, and political crises deepen and dominant institutions and relations of ruling become increasingly strained, new opportunities for exploiting these openings become available to actors ready to take advantage of them. This is precisely the place many fascist and far-right organizers, activists, agitators, and thinkers have intentionally maneuvered themselves into in recent years. For those of us concerned with trying to build a truly just, dignified, peaceful, and democratic society, the question is, what is to be done about this very real and potent threat, and what can engaged social research tell us? It's often been remarked by social movement scholars that one critical shortcoming of the field is that we have a tendency to study the movements with which we find affinity rather than those we do not. Dynamics of access, safety, visibility, personal identification, and relative power dynamics also play into which movements and groups get studied and which do not. Practically, this means we end up knowing a lot more about social justice-oriented movements than we do about their antagonists. This is a problem, particularly amidst an accelerating eco-social crisis complex. I have certainly been guilty of researching with movements that I identified with, and in recent years, I've come to see the limits of what I've described as solidarity research. Let me explain by way of a brief detour into my own history working with social justice-oriented social movements. There we go. My scholarly interest in social movements and social change emerged out of my fascination with the Zapatistas, a radical social change movement that had begun as an armed insurgency initiated by the Zapatista National Liberation Army in the Mexican state of Chiapas on January 1st, 1994. On the first day of the new year in 1994, several thousand indigenous Mayan insurgents, some armed with semi-automatic weapons, many others with nothing more than sticks, emerged from 10 years of clandestine organizing and 5 centuries of resistance and persistence in the face of genocide, colonialism, and imperialism, and declared war on the federal executive of the Mexican Republic and the Mexican Army. In statements issued during those first days of the new year, the insurgents of the EZLN declared that they had risen up in arms not to seize the state, but to smash a corrupt, violent, and illegitimate system so that Mexicans could freely and democratically govern themselves. They called the North American Free Trade Agreement a death sentence for the indigenous peoples of Mexico, but more than that, a rebellion for more than a rebellion for or against a particular kind of economic model, the Zapatistas articulated the rationale for their uprising in terms of justice, dignity, and democracy. The Zapatista Uprising did not topple the government of President Carlos Salinas, nor did it manage to defeat the Mexican army, but in many ways, the rebellion initiated by the Zapatistas would accomplish something as revolutionary and far less predictable as these goals. Indeed, as the dream of state-sponsored socialism lay for so many buried beneath the rubble of the Berlin Wall, what began as an armed uprising in the far southeast of Mexico would radically expand the horizon of political possibility on a global scale and spark a transnational movement of movements, beyond providing a powerful affirmation of the fact that, neoliberal dogma aside, resistance was indeed still possible in the midst of a new world order at the end of history. The Zapatistas would also provide the catalyst for a profound reimagining of on a transnational scale of the possibilities for and paths toward radical social change at the end of the millennium. In my research about the transnational resonance of Zapatismo, I sought to ethnographically probe the dynamics, promises, and pitfalls of a specific manifestation of the radical imagination, the collective capacity to envision ways of living otherwise that is a spark of powerful and robust social movements. This research and the work that subsequently emerged out of it was animated by the conviction that academic research can play an important role in supporting social struggles for radical social justice. This is not to privilege the academy. Rather, it is to assert that social movements produce knowledge, critical reflection, and theoretical insights about the world we collectively inhabit and how it might be changed. Academic research can play a role in highlighting and helping to collect and circulate this socially transformative knowledge, but only when movements are taken seriously as living laboratories of struggle and transformation, rather than studied like specimens under a microscope. Engaged in critical ethnographic research carried out in the spirit of affinity with struggles for social justice can also play a vital role in cultivating spaces and processes that facilitate critical and committed dialogue and debate among activists about issues that activists and organizers rarely have the opportunity to take up in the course of their day-to-day work. In this way, ethnographically grounded research with those engaged in social struggle is well suited to actually contributing to such struggles, instead of merely cataloging them without forsaking the critical perspective academic research can bring to bear on social phenomenon. Following this project, I looked for ways to combine my interest in social movements, the radical imagination, and publicly engaged research in a context closer to home. From 2010 to 2017, with Max Haiven, I co-directed the Radical Imagination Project, a social movement research project based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Launched in 2010, the project was an attempt to mobilize the unique position and resources of academic research to convoke, collectively summon into being, the radical imagination with radical social justice activists. In this way, we thought that academic research could contribute something meaningful to movements that they were not already doing for themselves. Starting the project in the aftermath of the global capitalist crisis of 2007, we were keenly aware of the impoverished public discussion about how to address what seemed to be an utterly broken capitalist status quo. While we held no naive beliefs about the inherently revolutionary nature of catastrophe, contradiction, and crisis, it struck us as nonetheless remarkable that the ability to imagine other ways of living together seemed so atrophied at this historic moment. In the spirit of what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have called undercommoning, we were committed to using the resources, space, and time provided by academic research to make solidaristic connections with others struggling for radical social change inside and outside of the university, and to use the research process as a way to contribute to these struggles. Eschewing the radical tourism so common to social movement studies, where researchers seek out high-profile and frequently cosmopolitan sites of struggle, we wanted to locate our intervention in a place that was more representative of many other places than the movement meccas to which researchers' eyes are so frequently drawn. At the same time, we wanted to curate a research process that would contribute to and learn from the radical milieu in Halifax, while offering lessons for other radicals struggling in many other places. We did not want to capture a static image of the radical imagination and the movements animated by it in a specific place and time. We wanted to facilitate a process of grassroots inquiry, capable of bringing diverse activists and movements together and catalyzing the radical imagination together. Because of its attention to lived experiences, ethnography is a methodological practice and perspective particularly well suited to exploring the effective, embodied, and imaginative dimensions of social movements, and it served as a basis for our research methodology. Our methods included one-on-one semi-structured interviews, community discussion events, and long-term participant observation in the radical scene in Halifax. We supplemented this with a public engagement component, including a political documentary film series, a speaker series, and a wealth of other public events organized around pressing political issues. Curating these critical dialogic encounters was the primary objective of the project, and many public events were organized and facilitated by us, but led by a host of invited speakers from community organizers to academics. Instead of mining interview, event recordings, or field notes for For data, we focused on using qualitative research as a way of bringing people into conversation with one another in a way that sidestepped without necessarily resolving personal and political disagreements and tensions that exist in any radical context. The point was not resolution of conflict or political synthesis, but critical dialogue focusing on issues integral to organizing and movement building, but not focused on any specific campaign, conflict, or struggle. Many participants reported that one of the most important aspects of the project was the opportunity to reflect on the diverse social justice work going on in a non-instrumental, intentional, and non-judgmental way. As we came to understand, one of the most significant contributions of our project was to help activists sustain themselves and their movements better. We came to think about this in terms of dwelling in the hiatus, the space and time occupying neither the airy reaches of victory nor the dreary depths of defeat, but the quotidian work of reproducing ourselves on a day-to-day basis. One issue that came to the fore in our research was just how steeped in capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal, and settler colonial relations of ruling our forms of organizing are. One contribution this research made, albeit modestly, was to hold open a space and time for those active in social justice struggles to discuss how to organize, why, for what, and to what ends. Without the time and space to sustain this careful self-reflection, movements risk reproducing the social relations they claim to oppose to the forms of organizing and struggle they employ. The Radical Imagination Project was a platform for researching, curating, and broadcasting movement-based knowledge grounded in the Halifax radical scene. It helped generate and sustain important conversations in social justice circles in Halifax, gave resources back to the radical community, and held public space open for important discussions relating to social justice and social change more broadly. Many of the discussions the project facilitated were worthy and important, from oppression and sexual violence in movement spaces to reparations for slavery and anti-Black racism in Canada. But it did not participate in ushering in a wave of social movement activity, nor did it heal long-standing fractures in the radical scene. In fact, both of our research cycles from 2010 to 2014, and then again in 2017, ended on pessimistic notes, with many longtime activists and organizers reporting a general sense of malaise and even hopelessness at the near and medium-term prospects for the kind of social change seemingly so desperately needed. The project has served as an archive of movement knowledge and memory in Halifax from 2010 to 2017, and assisted in keeping the spirit of social justice radicalism alive in dark times. These outcomes seem worthy, but very modest. What to take from this detour into my history as a scholar activist seeking to work with social justice-oriented social movements? Most basically, there's the problem of over-identification, where researchers become relatively uncritical boosters of the movements and groups they study. There's also the problem of focusing so much on the movements we like, that we see as good and worthy, that we lose sight of the much wider field of social movement activity that is populated by many, many other actors, many of whom we may express no affinity with, but remain important nonetheless. Finally, there is the problem of celebrating and projecting concepts that make sense to us as a specific type of knowledge worker under neoliberal capitalism, and misrepresenting, however unintentionally, the complicated, contradictory, and very long-term work of social change. I remain convinced that the radical imagination as a collective shared capacity to envision that which does not yet exist is central to powerful movements for social change. I also think there is something vitally important about our present moment that serves as warning and corrective to accounts, my own included, that have tended to celebrate the imagination in the context of struggles for social change. Well before the election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States, the signs were clear to anyone paying attention that something new, threatening, and important was gestating among the ecology of the far right. This activity has sought to mobilize not the airy heights of the imagination, but the visceral politics of the gut. My increasingly deep dive into the scholarship on fascism has convinced me that fascism operates less at the level of a shared imaginary and much more at the level of a shared intuition. Fascism is a mass politics of the gut, not of the mind. It is visceral, not cerebral. This may seem like an artificial distinction, but it's an important one. I'm in agreement with eminent scholar of fascism Robert Paxton, who problematizes what he describes as a cultural studies approach to fascism that attempts to decode fascist culture often by studying its cultural artifacts. While such study can be highly engaging and tell us much about how fascists presented their movements publicly, they do not tell us anything about how, why, and with what effects such cultural production occurred. With the caveat that much of this is preliminary and limited by the restrictions of conducting research in a pandemic, I want to turn to what a politically and publicly engaged anthropology can tell us in a time of fascist resurgence and far-right extremism. My current research focuses on fascist, radical right, and white power movements in North America. Right now, I'm researching what's known as Terragram, the network of fascist, white power, and far-right public channels on the encrypted messaging app Telegram. Some with tens of thousands of subscribers, these public channels are critical digital arteries for far-right and explicitly fascist identity formation, propagandizing, networking, strategizing, and skill building. Telegram has been a platform of choice for fascists and far-right extremists because of its free speech and privacy orthodoxy, although this has changed somewhat in the aftermath of the US Capitol insurrection in January 2021, leading Telegram to ban numerous far-right channels and users. Despite this, the app and its Terragram ecology remain popular. We've come a long way since the early days of the internet when, in the early 1980s, neo-Nazis and white supremacists used the first computer bulletin board systems to network with each other. But to focus on the infrastructure in many ways takes our attention away from what are some of the most important implications of this new era of neo-fascist, far-right, and white supremacist organizing. The development of a globe-spanning digital communication infrastructure, and particularly social media platforms, has been capitalized on by a new generation of far-right actors committed to meta-politics and fighting and winning the culture war. Meta-politics and culture war fighting need to be understood not as ends in themselves for neo-fascists, the far-right, and white power activists, but as a necessary threshold for the establishment of the white ethno-state. In what follows, I aim to sketch some of the contours of this struggle and the routes it travels, with a focus on its North American presence. This work is very much in its initial stages for me, so my conclusions are admittedly preliminary and partial, but also a stark reminder of the importance of bringing critical social research to bear on this urgent and alarming phenomenon. Critically, this is not only an attempt to learn about how to counter far-right and fascist movements, much less a defense of the bankrupt status quo. It is an effort to take this political activity seriously and to try to understand fascism's gravitational pull at a time of a deep crisis of legitimacy for capitalist and liberal institutions and practices. It's worth defining the terms of reference before delving in any further. While I consider a constellation of neo-fascist and white supremacist movements here, these movements are distinct, and in our current crisis-ridden moment, it is particularly important to be precise about what we mean by fascism. Eminent historians of fascism, Robert Paxton and Roger Griffin, have much to say on this, but here I reference the heart of their respective definitions. Paxton describes fascism as, quote, a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal constraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion, end quote. Griffin defines fascism as, quote, a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism, end quote. Palingenesis refers to rebirth or recreation, so another way of putting this in slightly more familiar terms might be a revolutionary form of populist ultranationalism. While fascism has never been entirely absent since its public emergence in the 1920s, the last decade has seen a dramatic global resurgence of fascist activity. If, as Federico Finkelstein argues, it is true that populism is fascism's heir in the post-war liberal democratic, for some, epoch, these fascist inroads are even more significant. This trend seems only to be increasing with greater temporal distance from the horrors of World War II and the Nazis' final solution. Post-war fascism in North America has been deeply influenced by the European New Right, and this is where the emphasis on metapolitics comes from, leading heavily on Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony, This perspective disavows, for the time being at least, the vanguardist or paramilitary and mainstreaming or political engagement iterations of far-right politics in favor of concentrating on intellectual and cultural production to overcome the spiritual, material, and racial degradation they attribute to this version of modernity. Speaking a confounding and well-camouflaged language of diversity through separation, this much more erudite white power rhetoric advances a vision of ethno-pluralism that nevertheless is steeped in a hatred for the other. In the words of Roger Griffin, quote, "It insists on the human right to belong to a distinctive, historically rooted culture, mythically conceived as ideally homogeneous and pure, one which is uncontaminated by the mass migration and globalization encouraged by the liberal democratic commitment to pluralism. Democracy is portrayed as a new totalitarianism, which promotes cultural genocide," end quote. As I explore shortly, this strategy has proven particularly effective and prolific in the thoroughly capitalized and profit-directed social media ecology. Advancing a metapolitical strategy that concretely takes the form of the endless, exhausting, and performative culture wars we've all become seemingly resigned to does not mean fascists and other members of the far right have abandoned either vanguardist or mainstreaming positions. If anything, far-right activity over the last decade demonstrates a blending of strategic and tactical choices that have blurred the lines between different fronts of struggle. This is perhaps nowhere more frighteningly or starkly illustrated than in the rash of lone wolf mass murders carried out by white supremacists, whose radicalization appears to have occurred mainly or exclusively online, and whose murderous actions were amplified and recirculated online. In Shitposting, Inspirational Terrorism, and the Christchurch Mosque Massacre, journalist Robert Evans examines the role of shitposting in the circulation of white supremacist and fascist ideas online. Evans describes shitposting as, quote, "the act of throwing out huge amounts of content, most of it ironic, low-quality trolling, for the purposes of provoking an emotional reaction in less internet-savvy viewers," end quote, with the ultimate goal of derailing meaningful discussion and distracting readers. Evans explores the Christchurch mosque killer's radicalization in a highly anonymous, atomized, and internet-mediated way, as well as his attempt to inspire more acts of white power terror by live streaming his massacre on Facebook and posting his manifesto to Twitter. Evans has also examined what he terms the gamification of white power terrorism, a trend manifested on image boards like 8chan, where posters express the desire to beat the high score of other mass murderers and adopt other aesthetic elements borrowed from gamer culture, including the live streaming of massacres by white power killers in the style of first-person shooters. In many ways, these trends represent a dramatic and disturbing acceleration of the dynamics of radicalization and extremist activity on the far right, and have set the stage for resurgent fascism. The communicative logics of the thoroughly capitalized space of the internet have only added fuel to this fire. In 1983, Ku Klux Klansman and white power guru Louis Beam penned his essay, "Leaderless Resistance," in the Interclan newsletter. In it, Beam sketched out a new vision of white power militancy comprised of clandestine autonomous cells of dedicated cadre committed entirely to the white power struggle and willing to, quote, "utterly destroy the movement's enemies," end quote. Responding to the state's effective attacks on centralized, formal, above-ground movement organizations on both the left and the right, Beam was among the vanguardist wing of the white power movement in the United States, who advocated for this vision of leaderless resistance and lone wolf insurgency. Beam's call would ultimately help usher in an age of white power terrorism in the US and Canada that has accounted for 3/4 of domestic terror killings over the last decade and spawned such infamous white power terror groups as the Order. Louis Beam would also innovate the use of the gestating internet in the early 1980s in support of white power activism. Tom Metzger with White Aryan Resistance in 84 and 85, and Louis Beam with Aryan Liberty Net in 84, used computer bulletin board systems several years before the internet became a social phenomenon. Stormfront was the first real North American movement website, established in 1994 by Don Black, former Ku Klux Klan leader. While it is commonly the Zapatista Uprising in January 1994 that gets linked with the birth of a new electronic fabric of communication and resistance, it's worth noting that white power activists were mobilizing the same infrastructure for their own purposes a decade earlier. But so very much has changed with respect to the reach and intensity of the internet's communicative capacity since then. In February 2015, Lindsay Savanorath, James Gamble, and Randall Shepard, three disaffected, alienated neo-Nazi 20-somethings, were foiled in their attempt to carry out a Valentine's Day mass murder at a mall in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. They chose the mall as a target because it represented consumerism, greed, and degradation, and provided abundant potential victims. Tipped off to the plot, Canadian law enforcement arrested Savanorath and Shepard at the airport when Savanorath arrived from the US. Gamble killed himself in his home in a suburb outside of Halifax when police arrived to arrest him. The three met and hatched their mass murder-suicide plot on Tumblr, bonding over their love of Nazi imagery, National Socialism, and the Columbine School Massacre, among other things. As journalist Mac Lamoureux notes, quote, "The role that the internet played in this crime cannot be overstated. Online, they were able to meet through Columbine jokes, indulge in their darkest fantasies, and plan a mass shooting on a messaging app," end quote. I juxtapose Beam's and Savanorath and Gamble's stories because I think they represent very different, yet fundamentally connected visions of leaderless resistance. Beam advances a dedicated cadre guerrilla struggle model compared to Savanorath and Gamble's nihilistic death cult, but both are manifestations of far-right terror set in the cultural context of their respective moments. What the internet makes possible is a scale and intensity of engagement through media not possible in traditional formats. Just like leftists, the far right has always made use of a variety of social media to spread ideas and forge connections. From book fairs to conferences, broadsheets to zines, cultural production, and more. Nevertheless, internet-based communication and especially social media platforms have facilitated a level of penetration into the fabric of daily life and a degree of intensity in terms of participation and effective engagement that far surpasses previous media paradigms. Gavin Titley assesses the state of play in our current moment, presciently noting, quote, "The internet and digital media are deeply ambivalent. The partial reordering of media gatekeeping and the reduction of significant barriers to entry have certainly engendered somewhat more pluralized public cultures, and the network dynamics of speed and circulation have extended the capacities of anti-racist counterpublics to respond, critique, and organize. And through the incessant industrial production of speech, news, opinion, commentary, images, memes, space for the circulation and amplification of racist repertoires is vastly increased," end quote. A densely populated digital media ecology inhabited by corporate entities driven exclusively by profit-making has furnished seemingly endless opportunities for the weaponization of free speech in the service of fascist and far-right agendas. Recent action taken by YouTube and Facebook against QAnon and Holocaust denial aside, these platforms have for years served as what Robert Evans has called Nazi-making machines, leading, as they do, consumers of their media down ever more extreme rabbit holes in order to keep people watching. What is particularly striking about these dynamics is that what would previously have required a potential movement recruit to actually go out into the world, physically encounter other movement members, attend meetings, occupy public space with all its attendant risks, and expend time and energy has now been replaced by much lower investment costs, at least initially. Digital infrastructure makes dabbling in neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and fascism much more anonymous, casual, and low cost than it would have been previously. And I'm aware of the time here, folks, and I'm just wrapping up now. Bear with me for just a minute more. In 2017, Metapedia, Stormfront, and the Daily Stormer were at the forefront of cyber fascism in North America. Since then, and perhaps especially in the age of the coronavirus pandemic, social media platforms such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter have come under increasing scrutiny for their role in platforming white supremacy and fascism. In Blood and Politics, his tour de force account of white power politics in the United States since the 1970s, Leonard Ziskin took stock of a new generation of white power activists coming of age in the early 2000s. His observations were prescient and bear quoting at length. Quote, "The generations after the post-war boomers have yet to fully take the stage. From this juncture, those now 20-plus-year-olds will determine the future directions of the white nationalist movement. They are tech-savvy and well-educated. Having not lived through World War II, they will not be chastened by the horrors of Hitlerism. Having never experienced Jim Crow and the struggles against it, they will be unburdened by its memory. Their only uniform will be their white skins, in a country where white people are increasingly a demographic minority among minorities. The prerogatives now accruing to majority status will be challenged as black, brown, and yellow faces increasingly populate the halls of economic and political power. The presidency of Barack Obama only confirms their notions of white dispossession. And in the decades to come, the next generations of activists will seek to establish a white nation state with definable economic, political, and racial borders out of the wreckage they hope to create of the United States. Some will kill and bomb and shoot their supposed racial enemies. Some will run for elected office and win. They will fight for local white control. Failing a complete victory, they will continue their cultural battle over symbols from the past and the history of the future, and they will draw on the legacy of those who resurrected white supremacy as an autonomous movement in the 1970s and brought it into the 21st century, end quote. We are in the midst of this cultural battle, but it certainly feels as though we are on the precipice tipping toward outright fascism. Across the overdeveloped capitalist North, the sure sensibility that mature democracies were inoculated against fascism has evaporated in the face of overlapping crises and the inherent limits of bourgeois liberal democracy. This is a critical juncture that a rigorous, nimble, social justice-oriented social science practice can usefully intervene in. Understanding the dynamics of white dispossession and radicalization in digital spaces seems critical to addressing the looming threat of a deep-seated sense of white grievance being fanned into outright boogaloo, or, to use an older term from the white power movement, racial holy war. Contemporary moral panics over perceived attacks on freedom of speech are a fitting index of the amplification of far-right paranoia by capitalist social media corporate entities. As Gavin Titley incisively observes, quote, "The narrow fixations of viewpoint diversity advocacy illustrate how racialized knowledge can be recuperated as an exercise in free thinking. Ideas that sought to shape human relations in the world and have been politically repudiated in that world are laundered as thought experiments that increase the reasonable plurality of the public sphere. With racism repudiated and closure achieved on its meaning, everything can and should be open and opened again and again," end quote. These are precisely the dynamics that have been mobilized in defense of white supremacy and in support of neo-fascist positions. As if we are trapped in an endless cycle, we are compelled to debate every dehumanizing, oppressive, exploitative proposition as if it were a neutral or novel phenomenon. Critical social research has contributed to exposing these toxic dynamics. Surely we can hope that it is capable of contributing to a future beyond them. And thank you very much, folks. That brings me to the end.